So since you last saw this pistol, I've gone ahead and applied a finish to it, so it's no longer just bare steel. And I went in and cleaned up a few areas. I also shot another match with this pistol since then. So we're gonna go ahead and talk about all of that in this video. So the finish that I chose for this 1911 was rust bluing, which isn't really typical on a 1911. That's more of a finish associated with much older firearms. The process is very old and pretty simple. You basically just rust the part in a controlled, deliberate fashion, and then you boil it in water. And what that does is it converts the red rust, the ferric oxide, into ferrous oxide, which is black or blue rust. And that's literally all bluing is. It's just a coating of controlled rust that to us looks pleasing as opposed to red rust. I followed Backyard Ballistics' excellent guide on rust bluing. So if you're interested in the process, go ahead and check that video out. Now, this was my first time bluing an entire gun, so I wanted to make a video about it, but not knowing how it was going to turn out, I decided to just focus on the process so I didn't screw it up. And let me tell you, the pucker factor was kind of real the first time I rusted up the whole thing. You know, here's a very nice several $1,000 custom hand-fit 1911 that's covered in rust. But there's only one way out at that point, and it's to finish the job. So now that I've done this gun, I'm pretty confident with the process that the next time I rust blue something, I'll probably make a video about it. In fact, I may even go back in and re-blue this pistol. There's some areas that I want to blend a little more, and a few spots that just didn't turn out exactly how I'd like. So you might see me re-bluing this gun. So with that said, I think the finish came out pretty good, and the color I achieved with the rust blue looks great in my opinion, but it wasn't what I expected. I expected it to be a little bit darker and more black, and I expected the polish areas to not be so shiny after bluing. I expected them to be kind of dulled out from the rusting process because that kind of etches the steel a little bit. So the top of the slide came out pretty much perfect and kind of how I initially wanted the whole gun to look, at least color-wise. It's a very deep black, especially once you've oiled it. Now on the sides of the slide and on the frame, it actually came out significantly lighter. It almost looks kind of thin, and that's probably because of the grit that I sanded those parts to. I sanded them all to 400 grit. As far as color goes, the sides of the slide came out as sort of a nice soft gray color, and the frame is almost kind of a gray bronzish color in the right light. And I think the difference in the color might have come from the different steels. The frame was made by a different manufacturer than the slide, so potentially the different alloys, steels reacted differently to the bluing solution. My other theory is that as I blued the gun, the water that I was using to boil the parts in got contaminated and caused the color to come out more of a gray bronzish color on certain parts. In any case, I am happy with how it turned out. The contrast between the slide and frame kind of reminds me of some of those Wilson Combats or Delta Force 1911s with the dark green olive drab frames and the black or Parkerized slides. What I really like about the finish is that because the bluing almost looks kind of thin and weathered, it looks like an old piece of steel that's much older than it is in reality, which is completely in line with the style of what I was going for with this pistol. It's a retro hardball 1911 setup for the sport of bullseye. On the original USGI National Match 1911s, the National Match slide was never original to the frame, so you'd sometimes end up with this two-tone look on those guns. Now, of course, those guns would have been Parkerized, not blued like this, but I think this calls back to it sort of in its own way. I was never setting out to make an exact replica of a National Match 1911. I wanted this gun to be unique with callbacks to those National Match guns, as well as just a type of pistol that people, civilians, would have competed with, you know, a half century ago. I think of this sort of like a classic car that's been resto modded, and in the process it was given a fresh coat of paint that's actually nicer than what would have been applied at the factory. Now, a few other cosmetic things I ended up doing to this pistol. I did decide to sand out the wavy marks left over from the surface grinding. I know I said I was wanting to keep those in the previous video, but I decided to get rid of them. Basically, I just took some pieces of glass, glued some sandpaper on them, and then sanded the sides of the slide completely flat with progressively finer grits of sandpaper. Pretty much everything except for the top strap was taken to 400 grit with sanding sticks, which are essentially just dowels or flat pieces of wood or steel with some sandpaper glued on them. And what that does is ensure that when you're sanding portions, you're not rolling any edges over like you tend to get when you just fold the sandpaper in half or use your thumb or something like that. Now, I also went in and finished blending up the grip safety. It was kind of hard to tell in the previous video, but there were definitely some very obvious file marks still in there and some weird low spots and a weird transition from the curved portion to the flat portion. So I went in, took out the low spots and blended in that transition. I think it came out great. You can see the finish on the grip safety didn't really come out so great. It's a little mottled, and I'm really not sure why, but I'm not too bothered by it. Now this is an area where the bluing is gonna wear down pretty quickly anyways, since it's always in contact with your hand, and I might re-blue this part in the future at some point. For the hammer, I decided to blue the hammer and then polish the sides back to white metal, which I think looks cool. I think the Colt Gold Cup National Match does the same thing. I'm a big fan of how that pistol looks. For some reason, the back of the slide and the ejector and the extractor just didn't really turn out great. And I think that's because this was finished with a Fordham and it probably had a little bit higher polish to it, so it didn't really want to rust as readily as some of the areas that were only polished to 400 grit or were bead blasted. Generally, a more polished, higher surface finish is always going to be more rust resistant than one that's rougher. Really, the only parts I didn't rust were the bushing, the barrel, the guide rod, and of course the trigger, which is aluminum, so it couldn't be blued. Now I did go and remove the bead blasted finish from the exposed portion of barrel that you can see through the ejection port. I went in with sanding sticks, then followed it up with some gray Scotch-Brite, and I think that makes the barrel really pop, and the contrast makes the bluing look a lot darker. I think all of the parts left in the white create a pretty good contrast against the bluing, making it look a little darker. Now, I also really like the contrast created by the parts that already had a finish on them, like the sights, the safety, the plunger tube, the slide lock, and the mainspring housing. These came with, I believe, a hot blue finish on them, which usually turns out much darker than rust bluing. And in the case of the safety, it looks like a manganese phosphate finish, which is a dark Parkerized finish. But I think the darker parts contrasted against the frame makes it, again, look really old school, like something you'd find in a military arsenal or belonging to a military shooting team. The pistols that the military used were never all original. They all got mixed up at some point, pretty much. Very few maintained all original parts beyond major components like the slide and the frame. And even then, oftentimes the slide and the frame would get mismatched, when they're re-arsenaled or repaired at armories and depots and arsenals, that sort of thing. Now what that ends up doing is creating a visual effect very similar to what you see here, a gun with parts that have several different finishes that don't exactly match up perfectly between the slide and the frame, and the controls, the mainspring housing, and so on. And again, this happened pretty much on accident, just like the slight color difference between the slide and the frame, but I think it looks really cool, almost exactly what I was going for, looking like an old military ball gun. Really, the only control surface I'm not really happy with is the magazine catch. On the right side of the gun, you can see where it didn't quite take to the bluing, and there's some of the original finish left on the side. I think I'm gonna go back in and re-blue this part at some point. And another area that didn't turn out great was the mag well area. Again, I just don't think the rusting solution took very well to the surface, or maybe the surface wasn't super clean. Now, the last thing I did cosmetically was I went in and contoured the dovetail base of the front sight. In the previous video, you could see the square edges of the dovetail kind of poking out of the slot. So I decided to take those down. I didn't really truly blend them into the slide. I just kind of scribed a line and then filed it down until the lines disappeared. And I think it came out pretty all right. Annoyingly though, I did this after I blued the gun, so I just kind of touched up the exposed metal with cold blue and called it good. But like I said, I'm probably gonna re-blue this pistol at some point, so that'll get solved eventually. So I just wanna take a quick second to talk about the channel sponsor, Michael Scott Earl. Michael Scott Earl is a New York Times best-selling author known for a wide variety of book series of many different genres, but the ones that I'm currently engaged in are his Star Justice series of books. You can go ahead and follow the link in the description or the pinned comment, and you can get the first book in this series for free in an ebook format. It's a sci-fi action-adventure series, so if that's something that interests you, go ahead and get the ebook. It literally costs you nothing. You can also get most of his books in an audiobook format, which has actually been my preference since I do a lot of driving, and I think the voice acting and narration is actually really well done. So thank you to Michael Scott Earl for sponsoring the channel, and also Bill is a big fan of Michael Scott Earl's books. So the only thing that I changed functionally from the previous video to now is I welded on some pieces of shim stock to the back of the trigger bow to take out some of the pre-travel. I'm gonna roll in some B-roll footage of a test piece so you can see my horrible spot welds of how I accomplished that. I was just using this part to learn sort of the best settings to use with a cheap Amazon spot welder that I got. Pre-travel is essentially just the space from where the trigger fully resets forward to where the back of the trigger bow touches the disconnector. So by welding up the back of the trigger, it has the effect of lengthening the trigger because the trigger's sitting further forward before touching the disconnector. If you take the pre-travel out on the front of the trigger, it effectively shortens the trigger because it pushes the trigger back to meet the disconnector. Usually you can take out the pre-travel from the front of the trigger by either adding material to the curved portions of the bow or cutting little tabs in the bow and then bending them outwards. Some triggers come with those tabs already cut in them. That's probably the most common way to eliminate pre-travel. Another follow-on effect of reducing or removing pre-travel and over-travel from the trigger, which this trigger is also adjustable for over-travel, is that it also shortens the reset. The reset is also affected by the overlap between the sear and the disconnector, but you really shouldn't mess around with that. But just by taking out the pre and the over travel in the trigger, you can significantly reduce the length of the reset. Now the trigger reset is something I just do not really care about normally, but I know some people do, and some people even try to use it as like a flex of how cool their custom gun is. So after taking out all the pre-travel and over-travel in my trigger has a reset length of a 32nd of an inch, which is under a millimeter. If you like a short reset, the easiest way to accomplish it is to eliminate any pre-travel and over-travel in the trigger. And this applies to pretty much any gun out there. And it's part of the reason why I think like the trigger bars and stuff that people sell for Beretta 92s that claim to shorten the reset are kind of a waste of money in my opinion. Reason number one, I really don't care about the reset. I mean, I shoot double action revolvers pretty often. Reason number two, they don't shorten the reset any more than drilling and tapping your trigger for pre and over travel adjustments would do. Or at the very least, just putting in an over travel screw, because Berettas have a ton of over travel from the factory. To get back on topic, after changing my trigger up, I did shoot another 270 shot match and I did fairly well. I didn't have any standout slow fire targets like that 98.5 I showed off in the first video. My best slow fire targets with this pistol that day were a pair of 94s, but it was kind of an off day, pretty much all day for slow fire. I mean, I shot my worst 22 slow fire target in like over a year. I shot an 86, which is about, 8 points below my average with my Hammerly. And I didn't shoot anything better than a 97 that day when I'm usually good for at least a 98 or a 99. I just had a lot of weird targets that day. Like at 25 yards, I had a 99 with 9 X's for timed fire. And then I also had a 50-yard target that ended up being a 92 with 5 X's with this pistol. And I think this target, again, speaks to how accurate this pistol is, because when I do everything right, this gun will punch an X, and that's exactly what was happening on that target. I mean, I lined up the sights, I pulled the trigger confidently as I accepted my hold in the center of the bullseye, saw the shot break with the sights centered and aligned in the bullseye, looked down the scope, and I'd see an X. And I just kept doing that, I shot like 4 X's in a row, and then I started almost getting like overconfident. So after that X streak, I kind of came in a little too hot on the trigger on the next shot, thinking, oh, there's no way that I can miss. And then I saw the shot break as the sights were moving up and to the left out of the bullseye, and I just knew it wasn't gonna be a good shot. If you've ever shot any amount of bullseye or high power or any type of sport like this where you're shooting at bullseye targets, you know how it is with calling your shots. If you see the shot break with your sights moving into the bullseye, it's probably a good shot. Now, if you see the shot break with the sights moving out of the bullseye, it's usually really bad. So after that 7, I think I shot another 10, another X. I kind of slowed down, but then I also shot a few other not so great shots to give me a total score of 92 with 5 X's. Other than that, my rapid and time fire scores were consistently much better than my previous 2 matches, and I even shot my first clean target with this pistol, which is a target with a score of 100%. And that's despite not practicing very much. I've been kind of taking it easy on shooting since I got my blood lead levels back. But overall, I would say that I slightly prefer the position of the trigger now after taking out the pre-travel, and I think I might attribute some of that performance increase to it. I only had 1 rapid fire string that ended up under a 90, and that was because I actually timed out and saved a round, which of course counts as a big fat 0. But beyond that, I was solidly in the 90s and even high 90s timed in rapid fire. High 90s consistently is where I want to be with this pistol all the time, and I think I should be getting to that point here soon. Overall, I finished the 45 match with a score of 860 and 32 X's out of a possible 900 points, which is my new personal best with this pistol. So now it looks great, shoots great, and the only thing left is for me, the shooter, to improve. So if you want to learn more about this pistol and how it was put together, including the whole build list and the reasons why, go ahead and check out my other video on it. Thank you always to my channel members for supporting the channel directly. You can become a channel member by clicking the join button next to the subscribe button. I'm also trying to get a Patreon set up right now, but they locked my account for some reason. Thank you also to Michael Scott Earl for sponsoring the channel. Thank you all for watching, and have a nice day.